I'm going to talk to you about the power of storytelling. So, as a journalist, I've spent the last 20 years telling other people's stories. So I've sat in living rooms up and down the country, and I've heard people speak for perhaps the first time about their lives. And there's always a moment in my interviews where they turn to their partner or their mother or their best friend and they say, "I've never even told you this before." And I love that moment. It's my favourite sentence ever, because then I see that light going on in their eyes, and I know that they've realised that they have a story to tell. And what they have to say is important, and this is their time to be heard. So I love that moment. But of course, I always knew this, because I know that all of us have a story to be told, because we've all conquered the world in our own unique way. The businesses that we've built, the children we've raised, the laws we've campaigned to change, the charities that we've started, even the lives that we've saved. And I suppose that my contribution sometimes to their causes can be telling their stories. So a few years ago, I started working as a ghostwriter. So I now write other people's books for them, their memoirs. And it's always a privilege to do this. And sometimes, they say that you only know somebody else if you walk a mile in their shoes. But for me, I sometimes have to walk a whole lifetime to, tell their story. And that's 90,000 words in their shoes. And I love it, because no two pairs of shoes are the same. No two pairs of eyes, no two stories are ever the same. And that's the brilliant thing about human beings, because we all have similar experiences, but the way that we act or react to them make us unique. And that's our story. That's your story. So the first book that I ever wrote was the story of Jo Milne, who was a deaf woman who spent the first 39 years of her life being unable to hear until she had cochlear implants. You may remember a video of her on YouTube that went viral of her hearing for the first time, and it was a really, really emotional watch, really, never mind to go through. But sadly, she was able to hear just at the same time as she was losing another sense, her sight. And I guess that her story appealed to me because, just like an actor assuming a role, I'd never played a part, if you like, of a deafblind person. And I thought, what an incredible experience it would be for me to just step into her world for a moment, or for a couple of months to write her book, and remind myself how lucky I am to have those two senses. So during our interviews, I closed my eyes and covered my ears and used her stick to just navigate the room, and she told me a little bit about what life's like for her. And that was just a tiny, tiny brief moment. I mean, I could never possibly imagine what it's like to be in that world. But I wrote her book, and her life changed so much ever since. She's now a speaker all around the world. She's recently taken part in a BBC documentary where she went to Bangladesh, giving the gift of hearing to children over there. And thousands of miles away from her home in Newcastle, a movie has been made of her life in Japan, which is kind of cool. And I just think how extraordinary that a woman who spent her whole life in silence managed to reach so many people using the power of her voice alone. I think that's incredible. And then there was a story of Hebo Waderi. So I knew very little about the subject of FGM, that's female genital mutilation, when I approached her to write her book. She was just a teaching assistant in a Walthamstow school and a busy mum to 7 children. And there was nothing unique about her story, so she thought. She'd been cut at the age of 6 back in Somalia. And there were also far more vocal campaigners already speaking out on the topic. But there was nobody quite like her, or that's what I thought. So I asked her if she would allow me to write her book for her, if she would let me put the words down on the page as she told me her story, and make her the author of her own life. And thankfully, she said yes, and we made a great manuscript. And her life changed too. She's now regularly invited all over the world as a speaker. She, what else has she done? She's all over the world, and she, most importantly, she goes into schools and she teaches children how to keep themselves safe, which I think is an incredible thing. And that, I guess, was my contribution to her cause as well. So I could feel like I'd played a little part in bringing her story to life and therefore, influencing people. And she tells me that the moment that she held her book in her hands for the first time was one of the most empowering of her life. And I always think back to that little 6-year-old girl who had laid in a tent for 2 weeks after being cut all alone and think, wow, that was such an amazing gift for her to be able to share her story and tell people about her experiences and maybe save another child from going through the same thing. And if she saved one child, that's enough. Her job's done. Amazing. And then there's a story of Adele Bellis, a 24-year-old woman who spent 7 years in an abusive relationship, which culminated in her ex-boyfriend paying somebody to throw acid over her face. I think maybe she's one of the last people that you would imagine had a voice back in those dark days. Can you imagine when she was cowering on the floor from this man's fists, that she could think that one day that her story, her voice, and her book would be stocked in bookshops and supermarkets up and down the country and making a change. That one day her voice would be louder than his. That's incredible, really, for her. And it is, because since writing her book, women have written to her and said, I've read your story and it resonates with me, and I see my story in yours, and I'm now determined to change the ending. And that's an amazing thing. And that's the power of storytelling. How just speaking out and telling your story can influence somebody else's life and can change a life and can save a life. So what could you do? What could the power of your voice achieve? Could you help another woman to start a business, to raise her children better? Could you give her that support? Could you help to change a law? Could you start a charity? Could you save a life? I think there's people in this room that could do that. So how do you use the power of your voice? Well, they say that you should write about what you know. So, for example, what are you passionate about? What are you the expert in? When has there been a moment when somebody has listened to your story and they've asked questions, or you've seen that light go on in their eyes, and they've listened so intently to what you're saying because it resonates with them? Because sometimes listening is the best gift that we can give somebody. Just giving them that silent space to speak is just an incredible gift for somebody. So I'd urge you all to think about what you can add to somebody else's life by sharing something of your story. And it doesn't have to be in a book, but it could be today when we have our lovely reception later, or it could be at a dinner, on a date, at a conference even, and you never know what may come of that just by sharing your story. And that's the power of storytelling. And for me, as a ghostwriter, my job is to stand in the shadows, so being here on this stage is a little bit scary for me today. And it's always amazing for me to watch my authors bloom and to hear about their successes, because I'm just simply the conduit, I'm the person who put pen to paper or typed, and I'm just the person that, captured their voice, but it always remains their story, it always remains their voice. So I guess that maybe by me sharing my story with you today, I might have inspired you to share your story. I certainly hope so. Because I think that sometimes it's time for every woman to step forward and say, this is my story, told in my unique voice. I am proud of my experiences, good and bad, and I would like to share them with you. Thank you.